Max Verstappen is winning, but something feels off, not on track, where he still looks untouchable, but behind the scenes, where the real battle in Formula One is already shifting. And what he has been hinting about 2026 is not just another driver complaint. It might be the first real sign that something deeper is happening inside Red Bull. Because here is the paradox. You are looking at a driver who has dominated an entire era, multiple championships, races controlled from lights out to checkered flag, a team that on paper should still be the strongest force in Formula One today. And yet, when Verstappen talks about the future, there is hesitation, not fear, but something close to doubt. And in Formula One, doubt is dangerous. This is not about one bad race, not about strategy mistakes or pit stop errors. This is about what happens when a driver who has everything starts questioning whether that advantage will still exist in the next phase of the sport. Because 2026 is not just another season, it is a reset. New power units, new aerodynamic rules, new balance of power. The kind of reset that has historically reshaped the entire grid overnight. So the real question is simple. Why would Max Verstappen, at the absolute peak of his dominance, start doubting Red Bull right now? And more importantly, what does he see that most fans are still missing? Because to understand that, you cannot just look at race results. You have to look at what is coming next. But to understand why this doubt even exists, we need to look deeper than just results. Max Verstappen is not just another champion. He is the defining driver of this era, the kind of driver teams build entire systems around. And Red Bull did exactly that. They built a car philosophy around his driving style, aggressive front end, sharp rotation, a machine that feels unstable to most drivers, but perfectly controlled in his hands. That is not an accident. That is engineering built around one driver's instincts. And the results speak for themselves. Dominant seasons, record-breaking performances, a level of consistency that turned races into formalities. But here is the part that casual fans often miss. Formula One dominance is never permanent. It is conditional. It depends on regulations, on timing, on the invisible balance between engineering and rule interpretation. And that balance is about to be completely reset. In 2026, Formula One is introducing one of the biggest regulation changes in decades. Power units will rely more heavily on electrical energy. Aerodynamics will shift again. And perhaps most importantly, teams that have mastered the current regulations may suddenly find themselves starting from zero. That matters, because Red Bull's current dominance is not just about Verstappen. It is about how perfectly the team understood the current rule set. Change the rules, and you change the advantage. Now imagine this from Verstappen's perspective. You are at the peak. You have a team built around you. You are winning. But you also know that in less than 2 seasons, everything that made you dominant might disappear. That is not a small risk. That is a career-defining moment. Because if Red Bull gets 2026 wrong, Verstappen does not just lose races. He loses control of his trajectory. And in Formula One, control is everything. We have seen this before. Dominant teams that failed to adapt. Drivers who stayed too long and watched their advantage fade. Careers that could have gone differently if one decision had been made earlier. And Verstappen knows this. He has studied the sport. He has seen what happens when the timing is off by even a single season. So when he speaks carefully about 2026, when he avoids full confidence in Red Bull's future, that is not random. That is calculated awareness. And here is where it gets uncomfortable. Because Red Bull is not just facing a technical challenge. They are entering unknown territory, building their own power unit program at a level they have never fully controlled before, competing against manufacturers with decades of engine experience. That is not a guaranteed success story, and Verstappen knows it. Which leads to a question that changes how you see everything. What if this is not about Red Bull being weak today, but about Verstappen recognizing a potential weakness before it happens? Because the best drivers do not react late, they move early. And if you are starting to feel that tension, that sense that something is building under the surface, you are not alone. That is exactly what makes this moment different. If you are seeing this pattern too, if you feel like something bigger is coming in 2026 that most people are not fully talking about yet, then you are already ahead of the curve. And that is exactly where the smartest fans stay. Because what looks like confidence on the surface might actually be the calm before a major shift. And that is where things start to get uncomfortable. Because Red Bull might not be as ready as everyone assumes. At first, it looked like just another regulation change. Formula One has seen plenty of those. Teams adapt, the grid reshuffles, and eventually, a new order emerges. But this time feels different. Because the deeper you look into 2026, the more you start to see cracks that are not obvious on the surface. And the first place those cracks appear is not in lap times. It is in preparation. Red Bull is entering a phase they have never fully controlled before. For years, their success has been built on a clear structure. One of the best chassis departments in the sport, paired with a proven engine partner. That balance gave them stability. It gave them confidence. Now that structure is changing. With the new regulations, Red Bull is moving into a more independent power unit program. That sounds like progress. It sounds like control. But in Formula One, control also means responsibility. And responsibility means risk. Because building a competitive engine is not just engineering. It is years of experience, infrastructure, and failure cycles that cannot be rushed. Manufacturers like Mercedes and Ferrari have spent decades refining that process. Even they get it wrong sometimes. So the question becomes very real. Can Red Bull match that level immediately? And this is where the tension begins to build. There have already been subtle signals, not headlines, not dramatic statements, but small moments that, when you connect them, start to form a pattern. Moments where Verstappen avoids giving full confidence in long-term projections. Moments where team discussions seem more cautious than before. Moments where performance is no longer assumed, but questioned. And then there is the internal pressure. Red Bull is not just a team. It is an ecosystem. Leadership changes. Technical staff movement. Shifts in direction that are normal for any organization. But in Formula One, even small instability can have massive consequences. Because this is a sport where milliseconds define everything. And those milliseconds often come from cohesion, from alignment, from trust inside the team. Now, imagine that alignment starting to shift, not collapsing, not failing, just slightly off. That is all it takes. And Verstappen, more than anyone, would feel that difference immediately. He is not just driving the car. He is the reference point for the entire system. If something changes, he knows. Which brings us to the second layer of this problem. It is not just about Red Bull's potential weakness. It is about timing. Because if there is even a small chance that Red Bull might not dominate under the new rules, every other top team is already preparing to take advantage. Ferrari is watching. Mercedes is rebuilding. McLaren is improving at a pace that cannot be ignored. And in Formula One, you do not wait to react. You anticipate. So when Verstappen looks at 2026, he is not just evaluating his own team. He is evaluating the entire grid. And that creates a different kind of pressure. Because now the question is not just, can Red Bull stay on top? It becomes, what happens if they do not? And this is where things get even more interesting. Listen closely to how Verstappen speaks in interviews. Not just what he says, but how he says it. The pauses. The careful wording. The lack of absolute certainty when discussing long-term plans. That is not fear. That is calculation. At first, it might seem like he is simply being realistic, but the more you analyze it, the more it feels like something else. Like he is already preparing for multiple outcomes. And once that mindset appears, it changes everything. Because a driver who is fully committed to one path speaks differently. There is clarity. There is confidence. There is no hesitation. But when there is even a small doubt, the language shifts. And we are starting to see that shift. So now the problem is no longer theoretical. It is layered. There is the technical risk of 2026 regulations. There is the organizational pressure inside Red Bull. And there is the strategic awareness of a driver who understands how quickly dominance can disappear. Each layer on its own is manageable. Together, they create uncertainty. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes this situation so difficult to read. Because from the outside, everything still looks strong. Wins, performance, control. But under the surface, the questions are getting louder. Is Red Bull actually falling behind before the reset even begins? Does Verstappen already see something coming that others do not? And if that is true, then we are not just watching a dominant era. We might be watching the early stages of its end. So, if it is not just about performance, if it is not just about one regulation change, then what exactly is Max Verstappen really worried about? Here is the part nobody is talking about. This is not really about speed. It is about control. Because in Formula One, control is everything. Control over the car, control over the team direction, control over your own future. And for years, Verstappen has had all of it. Red Bull built a system around him. Decisions aligned with him. Development followed his feedback. That level of control is rare, and it is powerful. But control is also fragile because it depends on stability. It depends on trust. And most importantly, it depends on predictability. 2026 removes all of that. Suddenly, the car concept is unknown. The engine performance is uncertain. The competitive order is unpredictable. And for the first time in years, Verstappen cannot be sure that the system around him will deliver. That is the real shift. It is not that Red Bull is weak. It is that Red Bull is entering a phase where outcomes are no longer guaranteed. And for a driver at Verstappen's level, that changes the entire equation. Because losing a race is one thing. Losing control of your trajectory is something else entirely. Think about it like this. An empire does not collapse the moment it loses a battle. It collapses the moment its leader realizes that the next battle might not be winnable. That moment creates doubt, and doubt changes decisions. So when Verstappen looks at Red Bull right now, he is not just seeing what the team is. He is seeing what it might become under a completely different set of rules. And that future is unclear. Now here is where it gets even more interesting. If you have made it this far, you are already seeing the same pattern. This is not just about performance metrics or technical data. It is about how a top driver processes uncertainty before anyone else reacts. So, I want to know what you think. Do you see this as a normal transition phase, or does it feel like the beginning of something bigger for Verstappen and Red Bull? Because the answer to that question might define how this entire era ends. And once that trust starts to shift, history shows us exactly what tends to happen next. Now let's look at the evidence. Because once you connect the dots, this stops feeling like speculation and starts looking like a pattern. Start with what Max Verstappen has actually said. Not headlines, not click-driven interpretations. His own words. Over the past months, whenever 2026 comes up, he avoids absolute confidence. He does not say Red Bull will dominate. He does not guarantee success. Instead, he keeps it measured, careful, almost like someone who understands how much is still unknown. That alone is unusual. Because when a driver fully trusts a project, you hear certainty. You hear commitment. You hear phrases that leave no room for doubt. But here, the tone is different. It is controlled. It is aware. It is prepared for outcomes that are not entirely positive. Then look at what is happening inside Red Bull. This is a team that built its modern success on stability, clear leadership, strong technical direction, a structure that allowed them to move faster than their rivals. But recently, there have been shifts, key figures changing roles, internal dynamics evolving, not chaos, but movement. And in Formula One, even controlled change can have consequences. Because performance is not just about parts on a car. It is about how well an organization operates under pressure, how quickly it can solve problems, how aligned every department is when something goes wrong. If that alignment is even slightly disrupted, the effect shows up later, not immediately, but when the rules change, when the system is tested in ways it has not been tested before. Now, add the third layer. Other teams are watching. Ferrari has been positioning itself for a reset, investing heavily in long-term development. Mercedes has already experienced a fall and is rebuilding with urgency. McLaren is closing the gap faster than many expected. These are not passive competitors. They are waiting for an opportunity. And 2026 might be exactly that opportunity. So from Verstappen's perspective, this is not just about Red Bull. It is about timing his career against the shifting grid. Because if Red Bull hits the reset perfectly, he stays in control. But if they do not, every other option becomes more valuable. And this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Top drivers rarely wait for decline. They move before it happens. We saw it with past champions. The moment they sense that the peak might not last, they start exploring, quietly at first, then more openly, not because they are disloyal, but because they understand the timing of Formula One better than anyone else. And Verstappen fits that profile perfectly. He is not reactive. He is proactive. He does not wait for confirmation. He reads signals early. So when you combine his cautious language, the internal evolution at Red Bull, and the aggressive positioning of rival teams, you start to see a very clear picture forming. This is not about panic. This is about preparation. And here is the insight. That changes everything. The best drivers in Formula One do not leave when their team becomes weak. They leave when they believe the future is uncertain. That is a completely different trigger, because uncertainty cannot be fixed overnight. You cannot guarantee results. You cannot promise stability. And once a driver starts thinking in those terms, every decision becomes strategic. So now, go back to the original question. Why does Max Verstappen doubt Red Bull before 2026? Because for the first time in years, Red Bull cannot offer certainty. Not about engine performance, not about competitive position, not about long-term dominance. And for a driver who has built his career on control, that uncertainty is the biggest risk of all. So here is the truth. Max Verstappen is not doubting Red Bull because they are weak today. He is doubting them because the future is unpredictable. And unpredictability is the one thing elite drivers try to avoid. 2026 is not just another season. It is a turning point, a moment where careers shift, where teams rise and fall, where decisions made before the change determine everything that comes after. And Verstappen knows that, which is why every word he says now matters more than ever. Because behind the calm tone, behind the controlled answers, there is a calculation happening. A long-term view of where he needs to be when the reset arrives. And if that path no longer guarantees control, then the next move becomes inevitable. And if that move happens, it will not just affect Red Bull, it will reshape Formula One. So the real question is not whether something is wrong today. It is whether we are already watching the early stages of the biggest driver decision of this era. And if you want to understand where this story goes next, if you want to see how this decision unfolds, and which team could change everything for Verstappen, make sure you stay with this channel. Because the next chapter of this story might already be in motion.